New Jersey, autumn 1976. The parking lot is an ocean of American steel and chrome. Sedans, station wagons, the occasional muscle car, baking under a pale autumn sun. The air smells of asphalt, distant leaves, and faint exhaust. This is not a place of monuments or ministries. It is a place of errands. The man walking across that lot is in his late 40s. He moves with a deliberate, almost rigid posture. His clothes, a serviceable jacket, trousers with a sharp crease, are neat but undeniably foreign in cut. His eyes, behind practical glasses, miss nothing. They scan the horizon line of the storefront, the flow of citizens pushing wide, clattering carts. He has faced down KGB interrogators. He has parsed data that could trigger global annihilation. But this is an entirely new kind of reconnaissance. He pushes through the glass doors. And stops. The wave of conditioned air hits him first. Then, the light. A relentless, humming fluorescence that falls upon a landscape of impossible plenty. Aisles, not of mere shelves, but of towering, colorful canyons. Yellow pyramids of lemons. Green avalanches of lettuce. Red rivers of meat under glass. 50 feet of breakfast cereal, boxes screaming with cartoon mascots. An entire aisle just for bread. Another for soap. His carefully maintained composure, the mask of the analytical professional, begins to fissure. He sees a woman, casually, without glancing at a ration book, drop 3 large beef roasts into her cart. A child throws a box of cookies in beside it. No one stops them. No one even seems to think about it. His breath catches. His hand rises slowly to his mouth. The sheer, staggering, mundane abundance of it all, the unthinking expectation of choice, strikes him with a force more visceral than any ideological argument. The data he had seen in classified briefings was one thing. This sensory reality is another. His eyes, behind the glasses, glaze over, welling with a profound, disorienting grief. For the life he left. For the lie he lived. For the millions on the other side of the world for whom a single, bruised orange was a luxury. A silent sob shakes his shoulders, there in the entranceway of the Grand Union supermarket, as the everyday paradise of American consumption flows indifferently around him. This was no ordinary shopper. He was Viktor Belenko, a top Soviet MiG-25 pilot. And his tears were the ultimate intelligence report on the Cold War. By the autumn of 1976, the great, grinding conflict of the 20th century had shifted. The trenches of World War II were a generation old. The hot wars in Korea and Vietnam were bloody, but peripheral. The Central Front was now psychological, economic, and ideological, a Cold War fought in shadow and symbol. Its primary weapons were not missiles, but images. Not just armies, but standards of living. For nearly 3 decades, 2 superpowers had presented competing visions for humanity. From Washington, a narrative of individual liberty and capitalist prosperity. From Moscow, a doctrine of collective sacrifice and socialist equality, promising a utopian future built on the grim foundations of the present. The world was the audience, and each system was desperate to prove its superiority. This contest found its most potent stage not in the halls of the United Nations, but in the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. The central question was brutally simple: which system could better provide for its people? In 1959, the iconic kitchen debate between U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made this explicit. Amidst the gleaming, pastel-colored appliances of an American model home at a Moscow exhibition, the leaders argued over washing machines and refrigerators. Nixon championed the convenience of the modern American housewife. Khrushchev retorted that the Soviet system focused on things that truly mattered. It was a surreal, profound moment. The geopolitical struggle was reduced to a debate over kitchen fixtures. But for the Soviet leadership, this was not mere theater. It was a vulnerability they knew all too well. The Soviet Union, ravaged by war, structured around heavy industry and military might, consistently failed at the soft war of consumer goods. Shelves in state-run stores were often barren. Quality was an afterthought. The choice was between what was available and nothing at all. Waiting in line for hours for basic necessities, meat, vegetables, shoes, was a universal Soviet experience. This daily, grinding scarcity was the regime's Achilles heel, a constant, quiet rebuttal to its propaganda of historical inevitability. To protect this fragile reality, the Kremlin built a fortress of information control. The Iron Curtain was not just a geopolitical border, it was a perceptual one. Western broadcasts were jammed. Possession of unsanctioned literature was a crime. Travel beyond the Eastern Bloc was an impossible dream for all but the most elite and trusted citizens. The state curated a reality for its people, one where the Soviet worker was the envy of the world, and the West was a crumbling, dystopian landscape of unemployment, poverty, and moral decay. For the average Soviet citizen, the American supermarket existed only as a piece of capitalist propaganda, a fantastical impossibility akin to a science fiction story. Yet, within this closed system, a privileged class did glimpse the truth. Military and scientific elites, like our pilot, had access to classified spravki, internal reports and intelligence summaries. They knew the comparative yields of American and Soviet agriculture. They saw satellite imagery of cities and highways. They understood the technological gap in microchips and computing. But this was abstract, bloodless data, numbers on a page, shadows on film. It was knowledge divorced from experience. It was a cognitive map of a world they had never smelled, touched, or tasted. They lived in a schizophrenic reality, pledging allegiance to a system their own secret data told them was losing the most fundamental race of all, the race to feed, clothe, and satisfy its own people. It was into this climate of controlled information and systemic scarcity that a young man from the coal mining regions of Ukraine would step, dreaming of the sky. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was born in 1947 in Nalchik, a son of the hardscrabble Soviet heartland. His childhood was post-war Soviet normalcy, austerity, collective purpose, and the omnipresent state. He was a bright, technically minded boy, and the Soviet system, excellent at identifying and funneling talent into its military-industrial complex, offered him a path upward. He entered the Soviet Air Force, not through privilege, but through aptitude and sheer force of will. He survived the grueling, often brutal, training regimen. He excelled. He became not just a pilot, but one of the best. His reward, and his gilded cage, was the MiG-25 Foxbat. To understand Belenko's defection, one must first understand the machine he flew. In the West, the MiG-25 had become a legend of terrifying proportions. First glimpsed by satellite in the late 1960s, its design was radical, vast, hammerhead wings, twin colossal turbojets, and a shape built for one purpose: pure, unadulterated speed. NATO intelligence was terrified. They believed it was a supermaneuverable, ultra-advanced air superiority fighter, a quantum leap beyond anything the West possessed. It triggered a frantic and expensive response, leading directly to the development of the American F-15 Eagle. The reality, which Belenko knew intimately, was far more complex. The MiG-25 was a masterpiece of brute force engineering. Built to intercept high-flying, supersonic American bombers like the B-70 Valkyrie, a program itself cancelled, it was essentially a stainless steel missile with a cockpit. Its radar, the Smerch-A, had such a powerful vacuum tube emission that it could allegedly fry a rabbit on the runway. But it was not agile. Its technology, while effective, was archaic. In an era where the West was pioneering miniaturized silicon, the Foxbat's electronics relied on heavy, outdated vacuum tubes. The aircraft was a symbol of Soviet philosophy: solve a problem with overwhelming, dedicated power, not subtlety. For Belenko, the Foxbat was both a privilege and a profound insight. To be trusted with this national icon, this Samolyet-Systrachik, interceptor aircraft, placed him in the innermost circle of Soviet military trust. He was based at Chigevka Air Base, a remote, top-security facility in the Primorsky Krai region, just 400 miles from the Japanese island of Hokkaido. His life was one of regimented secrecy. His world was the base, his aircraft, and the tightly controlled information drip-fed to him and his fellow elites. He saw the dichotomy firsthand. He was handed the keys to a machine that could fly at Mach 3 and reach the edge of space, a tangible proof of Soviet technical might. Yet, he returned from these flights to a base where the quality of food was poor, where consumer goods were shoddy or absent, where the political officers, Zampolits, droned on about the moral decay of the West, a West he was now professionally required to study in secret briefings. The cognitive dissonance grew. The data in those classified reports clashed with the daily reality of Soviet life. He knew, in theory, of American agricultural output. He knew, in theory, of Western living standards. But theory is bloodless. The stress was personal, too, a failing marriage, a sense of claustrophobia within the system he had once embraced. He later described a growing, chilling realization: he was a cherished cog in a vast machine he no longer believed in, defending a truth he knew to be a lie. The MiG-25, for all its thunderous power, could not outrun that simple, crushing epiphany. The stage was set. The pilot, the machine, and the destination, Japan, the nearest capitalist territory, were now aligned. All that was required was a decision, and a moment of unimaginable courage. The Soviet supermarket, the Gastronome or Universum, was not a retail space, it was a theater of the planned economy. Its sparse shelves were a daily, physical lesson in socialist theory. The state determined need. The state allocated supply. The citizen's role was to queue, accept, and be grateful. Choice was an alien, almost bourgeois concept. This scarcity was not merely an economic failure, it was, perversely, a pillar of control. When everything is scarce, everything becomes a privilege granted by the state. A pair of jeans, a bottle of Czech beer, a citrus fruit at New Year, these were not just goods, they were rewards, symbols of status or connections within the system. Against this grim backdrop, the state propaganda machine worked overtime to reframe this deprivation as virtue. Western abundance was painted as decadent, wasteful, and spiritually empty. Newspapers like Pravda printed cartoons of obese Americans gorging themselves while the poor starved outside. The message was clear: their plenty was a lie, a grotesque facade covering moral rot. Our sacrifice is noble, our emptiness is, in fact, purity. For a man like Belenko, this created a profound internal conflict. As an officer, he received a slightly better ration, more access to meat, perhaps better quality clothing. He had achieved a small measure of the system's plenty. But his intelligence briefings showed him the objective data: caloric intake per citizen, square footage of housing, automobile ownership. The numbers did not lie. The West was not starving. The cognitive dissonance for the intelligent, the curious, could be unbearable. You are told the wall is white, you are shown white paint, but your own eyes, in a forbidden glimpse, see it is undeniably black. The supermarket he would later walk into would not just show him food, it would shatter, in one visceral moment, a lifetime of constructed reality. It was the ultimate propaganda, not from a state, but from reality itself. Belenko was a product of the most advanced technical education the Soviet Union could offer. He thought in schematics, performance envelopes, and radar signatures. His intelligence on the West was of the same character: technical, quantitative, and disembodied. He studied photographs of F-15 prototypes. He memorized the estimated range of NATO air defense radars. He knew the specifications of American life: GDP per capita, average horsepower of family sedans, steel production tonnage. This is the cold, dry language of espionage and state analysis. It is data without texture. He knew America produced 10 million tons of beef annually. That is a number. He did not know the smell of a well-stocked meat counter, the chill of the air, the sound of plastic-wrapped steaks being tossed casually into a cart. He knew the U.S. had extensive highway systems. He did not know the feeling of a vast parking lot full of personal vehicles, the very symbol of individual mobility and economic choice. His defection, therefore, was an act of converting abstract intelligence into tangible, sensory truth. He did not flee just to share the MiG-25 secrets, though that was the decisive military act. He fled, on a deeper level, to resolve the painful gap between what he knew and what he could experience. The CIA and its counterparts excelled at gathering the former. They could intercept communications, analyze satellite imagery, and debrief defectors for facts. But they could scarcely understand the psychological impact of the latter, the moment when a lifetime of classified graphs and charts resolves into a simple, overwhelming image of a housewife choosing between 15 brands of peanut butter. For Belenko, the MiG-25 was the ticket to this experiment. He would trade the ultimate Soviet technical secret for the ultimate Western experiential truth. Belenko did not inhabit the same Soviet Union as the factory worker in Moscow or the farmer in Ukraine. He lived within the nomenclatura of military secrecy, a world of guarded installations, special polyclinics, and spectrospreadolittle, special supply centers with marginally better goods. This privileged access was a double-edged sword. It insulated him from the worst of Soviet scarcity, but it also exposed him to the regime's most closely guarded truth, its profound insecurity. As a trusted pilot of a frontline strategic asset, he was subject to relentless political indoctrination and security vetting. The message was one of constant threat and moral superiority. Yet, this indoctrination was undercut by his own eyes and the secret data he was shown. He could see the shoddy workmanship on non-essential parts of his own mighty jet. He experienced the logistical failures, the delays in parts, the inconsistent fuel quality. He lived a life of stark contrasts, wielding a sword of apocalyptic power, yet returning to a barracks where the plumbing often failed. This created a specific and potent form of disillusionment unique to the elite. The common citizen might grumble about empty shelves, blaming local bureaucrats. But a man like Belenko could see the systemic failure. He understood that the shoddiness and the scarcity were not accidents, but features of the same centralized, inefficient system that also produced the magnificent, terrifying MiG-25. The state could marshal unlimited resources for a project of military prestige, but it could not, or would not, provide a reliable supply of fresh vegetables. The cognitive burden of holding these two contradictory truths, military brilliance and civilian neglect, became a form of psychological torture. The secrecy he was sworn to uphold was not just about protecting state secrets from the West, it was about protecting the myth of the state's omnipotence from its own most valuable servants. A pilot defecting with a frontline aircraft is not an impulsive act. It is a military operation in itself, planned with the precision of a combat mission. Belenko's defection was a cold, calculated gamble against impossible odds. Every detail had to be considered. Fuel, he needed a plausible training flight profile that would load his MiG-25 with enough fuel to reach Japan, but not so much as to arouse suspicion. Navigation, he would have to fly at ultra-low altitude, under Soviet radar coverage, using basic pilotage over unfamiliar terrain, then find a remote, civilian airfield in Japan without being intercepted by either Japanese or American fighters who would see him as a hostile. The aircraft, he had to avoid triggering the IFF, identification friend or foe, system in a way that would immediately brand him as a rogue, and he had to hope his emergency systems didn't include a secret self-destruct or homing beacon. But the greatest calculation was human. He was leaving behind everyone and everything, his family, his comrades, his nation. He knew the KGB's doctrine of activnae meropriatia, active measures, against traitors. His family would be punished, used as hostages, publicly vilified. His name would be erased. He would be portrayed as mentally unstable, a criminal, a dupe of imperialists. The psychological weight of this planned betrayal, carried alone for months, is almost unimaginable. He wasn't just flying to freedom, he was incinerating his past life. The moment he pushed the throttles past his authorized flight path, he crossed a moral and personal Rubicon from which there was no return. The tears in the supermarket, days later, were partly for the life he had voluntarily, and with immense pain, destroyed. The decision, September 6, 1976. The sky over Chigevka was a flat, neutral gray. It was a Tuesday. The mundanity of the day was its own camouflage. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko performed his pre-flight rituals with a calm that masked tectonic inner activity. The MiG-25, call sign 31, sat on the tarmac, its steel skin dull under the overcast. To the ground crew, it was another routine training flight for a trusted pilot. To Belenko, the aircraft was no longer a weapon of the state. It was now his personal vehicle of deliverance, a 40-ton ticket to a truth he had to verify. He had planned this for months. He had memorized maps, calculated fuel consumption to the liter, studied weather patterns for the Sea of Japan. He knew the Soviet radar gaps at low altitude. He knew that once he dropped below a certain height over the coastal ranges, he would be a ghost, a fast-moving, unseen anomaly. The mission profile he had been given provided the cover, a navigational and intercept drill. It would take him east, toward the coast. It was the perfect vector. At 12:50 p.m. local time, he received clearance. The twin Tumansky R-15B turbojets ignited with a world-shaking roar, a sound he had once associated with patriotic duty. Now, it was the sound of his own rebellion. He lifted off, the airbase shrinking beneath him, a model of the world he was leaving. He followed the authorized flight path initially, playing the part. Then, at the predetermined point, he began his descent. He pushed the control stick forward. The Foxbat, built to soar at 80,000 feet, now dropped toward the wrinkled green carpet of the Sikhotalin Mountains. He leveled off at a heart-stoppingly low altitude, mere meters above the treetops. In the cockpit, the world became a rushing green blur. This was the most dangerous leg. A single miscalculation, a bird strike, a moment of distraction, and he would be a fireball lost in the wilderness, his fate forever a mystery. His eyes flickered between the terrain and his instruments, his body tense, every sense screaming. He was flying faster than sound, lower than any sane pilot would, navigating by river valleys and mountain peaks, a modern-day Icarus fleeing not the sun, but his own earthbound rulers. Below him, Soviet radar operators saw his blip. Then, as he dove into the radar shadow of the mountains, they lost him. To them, it was a momentary anomaly, a technical glitch perhaps. Alarms did not immediately sound. The system, so confident in its control, was slow to conceive of such audacity. For Belenko, those minutes in the mountain shadows were an eternity of suspended animation, a limbo between two lives. He was neither here nor there, a man in a metal shell hurtling toward an irreversible decision. The coast approached. Beyond it, the gray expanse of the Sea of Japan, and somewhere in the haze, the shores of Hokkaido. He had burned his bridges. There was only forward. The revelation, Hakodate Airport, Japan. Emerging over the Tsugaru Strait, Belenko faced a new and immediate peril, finding a place to land. His fuel was critically low. His initial target, the U.S. shared Misawa Air Base, was beyond reach. Through the haze, he spotted the civilian Hakodate Airport. It was far from ideal, its runway was short, cluttered with commercial airliners and small civilian planes. For a MiG-25, designed for endless, pristine military strips, it was a postage stamp. But it was land, and it was freedom. What followed was a scene of surreal chaos. At 1:51 p.m. Japan Standard Time, a monstrous, howling shadow swept over the terminal. The MiG-25, with a deafening sonic crackle from its engines, slammed onto the runway at over 320 km per hour. Belenko stood on the brakes, the tires screaming and smoking. He deployed the drag chute, but the runway was disappearing fast. He veered off the tarmac, the aircraft's nose gear tearing through soft ground before lurching to a stop just meters from a commercial jetliner. He had, against all odds, arrived. The response was pandemonium. Japanese police and airport workers, armed with nothing more than batons and confusion, surrounded the strange, menacing aircraft. Belenko, following a pre-rehearsed drill, popped the canopy. He did not raise his hands in surrender. Instead, he fired his survival pistol, a signal flare, into the air, a pre-arranged sign to any Western intelligence assets that this was a deliberate defection, not a hostile attack. He then shouted the only English phrase he had practiced for this moment, CIA. Call the CIA. Within hours, the world's intelligence agencies erupted. The Japanese, neutral and stunned, secured the scene. American assets were scrambled. In Moscow, a storm of silent, panicked fury began to gather. The Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor, a national symbol, was now sitting in a foreign civilian airport, its pilot actively seeking asylum. But the true climax, the profound personal turning point, came not on the tarmac, but days later, after the initial debriefings. Once in secure U.S. custody and beginning the long process of interrogation, Belenko was given something his new handlers considered a basic courtesy, a visit to a supermarket to procure personal items. It was a logistical afterthought for them. For Belenko, it was the culmination of his entire journey. The Grand Union supermarket in suburban America was the opposite of Hakodata's frantic drama. It was quiet, cool, and overflowing. This was the moment the data became reality. Here was the tangible proof of the system he had risked everything to reach. The abundance was not in military parades or missile silos, it was here, in the endless rows of sugared cereals, the mountains of produce, the gallons of milk. It was in the casual, unthinking way people moved through this plenty, as if it were a natural state of the world. His analytical mind, trained to assess threats and calculate trajectories, short-circuited. The emotion he had suppressed during the perilous flight, the cold focus of his planning, the fear for his family, all of it collided with this sensory overload of peace and prosperity. The tears were not of joy, but of profound, disorienting grief and realization. He was weeping for the scale of the deception perpetrated on his people. He was weeping for the years of his life spent in the service of a lie. He was weeping because in this bland, fluorescent-lit temple of consumption, he finally, fully understood what he had left, and what he had chosen. The MiG-25's secrets would be pulled apart by Western engineers in a hangar, yielding priceless intelligence. But in that supermarket aisle, Viktor Belenko delivered his own, more devastating intelligence report, on the soul-crushing weight of scarcity, and the revolutionary power of a simple, unconstrained choice. The fallout from Belenko's landing at Hakodate was instantaneous and bifurcated. On one side of the world, it was an intelligence windfall of historic proportions. On the other, a diplomatic and propaganda catastrophe of the highest order. For NATO, the MiG-25 was the ultimate prize. Under the gaze of a massive security cordon, American C-5 Galaxy transports arrived to dismantle the aircraft. It was taken to Hyakuri Air Base, where a joint U.S.-Japanese technical intelligence team, led by experts from the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, began the most thorough exploitation of a Soviet weapon system in Cold War history. For 67 days, they took it apart bolt by bolt. What they discovered was, in its own way, as shocking as the defection itself. The Foxbat was not the superfighter of NATO's nightmares. Its airframe was constructed not from cutting-edge titanium, but from nickel-steel alloy, heavy and heat-resistant. Its radar, while powerful, used obsolete vacuum tube technology. Its engines, magnificent in raw thrust, had a tragically short service life when pushed to their limits. The myth of Soviet technical supremacy in this arena was punctured. The intelligence was not just about the MiG-25, it revealed the entire Soviet design philosophy: brute force over finesse, specialization over versatility. This knowledge directly influenced the tactics and confidence of Western air forces for a generation. The panic that had spawned the F-15 was, in part, alleviated. The Eagle was, in fact, superior across the board. In Moscow, the atmosphere was one of cold fury and frantic damage control. The Politburo was humiliated. The KGB launched an immediate and vicious campaign of desinformatia. Through TASS and other channels, they spread the story that Senior Lieutenant Belenko was a mentally unstable, alcoholic pilot who had gotten lost in fog and made a navigational error. They claimed he was being held against his will by the Japanese and American authorities. Privately, the retribution was swift and brutal. His family, his wife, his young son, his parents, were instantly disappeared into the internal exile system. They were interrogated relentlessly, stripped of privileges, and publicly shamed as the family of a traitor. It was a calculated message to every other elite: the cost of betrayal is paid by the blood of your loved ones. Diplomatically, the Soviets mounted immense pressure on Japan. They demanded the immediate return of the stolen aircraft and the pilot, whom they labeled a criminal. They threatened economic repercussions and increased military posturing. The Japanese government, caught between its American alliance and its desire to avoid provoking the Soviet giant, performed a delicate dance. They allowed the US to fully exploit the jet, but after 2 months, they returned the disassembled aircraft to the Soviets, in crates. The symbolism was profound and insulting. Their priceless national symbol came back not flying, but in boxes, a pile of analyzed and understood scrap. Viktor Belenko ceased to exist in the Soviet Union. His name was erased from records, his image purged, his achievements nullified. In the West, he was reborn under a new identity, a prized asset entering the witness protection program in all but name. The US government granted him asylum, citizenship, and a generous stipend. He was debriefed for thousands of hours, his knowledge of Soviet air defense, pilot training, base security, and life inside the system providing a mosaic of invaluable human intelligence that complemented the technical dissection of his jet. But the man who emerged from this process was neither a simple hero nor a mere traitor in the eyes of the world. In the West, he was a potent symbol of the Cold War's moral conclusion, the individual fleeing tyranny for freedom. His supermarket tears became an anecdote repeated in congressional hearings, in editorials, and in policy papers as the ultimate indictment of the Soviet system. It was human, relatable proof that all the missiles, tanks, and propaganda could not compensate for a system that failed at the most basic human level: provision. For Belenko personally, the aftermath was complex and shadowed. He remarried, worked as an aeronautical consultant and lecturer, and lived a comfortable, quiet American life. Yet, he was forever separated from his past. The fate of his first family was a permanent, private sorrow. He knew the KGB's long arm and its doctrine of perpetual vengeance. He lived with a certain vigilance, a man who could never fully escape the consequences of his singular act. His defection also triggered a wave of paranoia and purges within the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus. Security procedures were overhauled. Political officers increased their scrutiny. Trust within elite units was eroded. The system's response was to further isolate itself, to tighten control, seeing betrayal not as a symptom of systemic failure, but as a personal moral disease to be rooted out with even greater zeal. The MiG-25 itself was never the same. While it remained a formidable high-speed interceptor, its mystery was gone. NATO developed specific tactics to exploit its weaknesses. Its strategic value as a psychological weapon was irreparably diminished. The Soviets were forced to accelerate the development of its successor, the MiG-31, incorporating lessons learned from the Foxbat's exposure. Belenko's story did not end the Cold War. But it provided one of its most crystalline moments of clarity. In the balance between a weapon that could fly at the edge of space and a supermarket aisle full of food, the world saw a pilot's verdict on what constituted real power, real strength, and a life worth living. The aftermath was measured not just in changed military tactics or diplomatic notes, but in the quiet, pervasive knowledge that the central lie of the Soviet state had been laid bare by one of its own champions, in the most mundane of settings. The Cold War was often measured in the stark, towering metrics of might, megatons of yield, numbers of warheads, divisions of tanks. It was a contest of spectacular, terrifying symbols, the Kremlin spires, the Pentagon's corridors, the parabolic arc of ICBMs against the stratosphere. Yet, history's most profound verdict on that half-century of tension was delivered not in a treaty hall or on a battlefield, but in the quiet, fluorescent hum of a suburban supermarket. Viktor Belenko's journey, from the closed, controlled world of a Soviet airbase to the overwhelming abundance of an American grocery aisle, encapsulates the true essence of that conflict. It was, at its core, a war of realities. One system offered its people a narrative of collective sacrifice for a distant, radiant future, a future perpetually deferred. The other, for all its flaws and inequalities, offered a tangible, overwhelming present of individual choice. The tears of a top Soviet defector were not simply for food. They were for the revelation of scale, the staggering distance between the constructed reality he had left and the operational reality he now inhabited. They were an involuntary eulogy for the millions who would never know that such a mundane paradise could exist. In that moment, the ideological abstractions of capitalism and communism dissolved into a simple, human truth, the profound dignity of not having to queue, of not having to scheme, of simply being able to choose. The MiG-25 Foxbat now sits in museums, a relic of steel and ambition. The intelligence it yielded has long been assimilated and superseded. But the image of a hardened combat pilot weeping before a wall of soup cans endures. It reminds us that the most potent weapons in any conflict are not always the ones that fly the fastest or strike the farthest. Sometimes, they are the most ordinary things, a full shelf, a stocked freezer, the unthinking liberty of plenty. In the end, the supermarket aisle proved to be a terrain more decisive than any airspace, and a simple can of peas held more persuasive power than any manifesto.